This video will explain the reductio variant on the arrow in strategy. So the reductio variant on the arrow in strategy says, use when your goal is a conditional, but you don't see how to get the consequent directly. Begin with an arrow in strategy, and then within the arrow in strategy, use the reductio strategy. I will show how this works with an example. So consider the argument that has the premise, if A and B, then C and not D. If not D and A, then if P, then Q. P and not Q. All of this leads to the conclusion, if A, then not B. So we'll start this just like any arrow in proof. We will start by assuming the antecedent, A, and trying to derive the consequent, not B. If so, then we can derive A arrow, not B, from that. Okay, by arrow in. However, when we look at the consequent, not B, we don't see any way to get that directly because there's no not B anywhere in the premises. So we're going to have to try and get it indirectly. So we will assume the opposite of not B, so we'll assume B. And we'll try to derive a standard form contradiction from that. If so, then we can get not B by dash in. Okay, so since we've got provisional assumptions in our proof, we now need an assumption dependence column. So lines 1 through 5 will all depend on themselves because they're all either assumptions or provisional assumptions. Okay. So now we can start our derivation. So now on line 6, we can get A and B by 4, 5, ampersand in. And that will depend on what 4 and 5 depend on, so that will depend on 4 and 5. Then once we have A and B, we can get C and not D from line 1 and line 6 by the rule of arrow out. So that will depend on whatever lines 1 and line 6 depend on, so that means it will depend on 1, 4, and 5. Make everything line up all nice and neat here. Otherwise it will be very hard to follow. Okay, so now that we have C and not D, I'm going to derive not D by 7 ampersand out. And so that will depend on what line 7 depends on, so it will depend also on 1, 4, and 5. Then once I have not D, I can get not D and A by 8 and 4 ampersand in. And so that will depend on what line 8 depends on and what line 4 depends on. So it will depend on 1, 4, and 5. Once I have not D and A, I can derive P arrow Q from 2, 9 arrow out. So that will depend on what line 2 and line 9 depend on. So that will depend on 1, 2, 4, and 5. Then I need to get P out of line 3. So my next line is going to depend on 3. So I'm going to get P out of line 3 by ampersand out. And I can use that to get Q out of line 10. So my next line will depend on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I get Q by 10, 11, arrow out. Then I can get not Q from line 3 by 3 ampersand out. And that will give me my standard form contradiction. So my standard form contradiction will be Q and not Q. It will depend on 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And that will be justified by 12, 13, ampersand in. Once I have my standard form contradiction, I can derive my goal, not B, and that will be by the line that contains the provisional assumption that's the opposite of the not B, so the B here on line 5, through the standard form contradiction, so through line 14. And that will depend on everything that the standard form contradiction line depends on, so everything line 14 depends on, except for the provisional assumption that's the opposite of what I'm trying to derive, so except for 5. So this will depend on 1, 2, 3, 4. Now that still depends on a provisional assumption, and it still depends on line 4, but that's okay because we're not done, so we haven't broken the big rule until we're done. It's only the last line that can't depend on a provisional assumption. Okay, so line 16 will be justified by the rule of arrow in, and the lines will be the line that contains the antecedent, the provisional assumption of the antecedent, so that's 4, through the line that contains the consequent, so 4 through 15, arrow in. And so that will depend on everything that line 15 depends on, except for 4. So that will depend on 1, 2, and 3. And that's our proof. So you can see here the reductio variant strategy. We started with an arrow in strategy. So that's that first provisional assumption to try to get to the consequent, not B. But we couldn't see how to get not B directly. So we assumed the opposite. We assumed B. And that led us to a contradiction, so that we could then get not B by dash in.